Hello, fellow pushers. This is Grant Lindenberg coming to you with another edition of Pushing Cardboard. This is episode 19, Jerry White Goes West. I'm just back from GMT's spring weekend at the warehouse event where I played a few games and managed to get a couple of interviews as well. This episode will consist of the first of those interviews, so no dive on a game this time, as this is a lengthy deep dive with designer Jerry White. He of Atlantic Chase, as well as Enemy Coast Ahead series and the Skies Above series, and a few other games. So no dive on games from me. We'll just have a big yak with Jerry. Last episode was another popular one. This one set a new personal record for most downloads in its first 30 days. So I think a fair number of you were happy with the return to World War II for a change of pace. I guess we'll get talking to Jerry. We'll get a fair amount of talk about World War II as well. In terms of news and what I've been playing, I'll keep this fairly brief as there's plenty of content this time as it is. I'll do a full write-up on my trip to the warehouse, and I'll publish it at pushingcardboard.com, and you'll be able to see what I played and who I met, etc. But there were a couple of things there that felt like news. The first is that Gene Billingsley's monster solo game, Mr. President, is out, and it was being demoed at the convention, so I got to see it in action. It is huge. It looks almost overwhelming, which I imagine is a great metaphor for what it feels like to be the president. It takes up a lot of table space. It's beautiful. Clearly a labor of love for Gene, and he happily played it and demoed it all weekend. The other news is that Mark Simonich is retiring. Don't worry, not from designing, but from being head of the art department at GMT. I think Gene said that he was finishing up in June. I didn't manage to get a formal interview with Mark, but I did find myself sitting next to him at one point, and we had more of an informal chat. I asked him what sorts of games he was going to focus on post-retirement, and he said his Zockbon series, obviously. I asked him about his Hannibal game, and his Caesar Rome versus Gaul, his two CDGs. He said there'd be some tweaks made to the Caesar game. I think made to smooth out a couple bumps and address balance. When I mentioned that the U.S. Civil War game was my all-time favorite game of his, I was happy to hear that it's his favorite game of his as well. And while he has no immediate plans to use that system again, he did say there are a couple of conflicts that he thinks would really fit into that activation system. So perhaps down the road, we'll see another game using those mechanics. I also mentioned that I was a big fan of The Legend Begins, an early game of his from going back to 1991 that he self-published with his, I think Rhino Games or Terran Games. I can't remember. Anyway, he said that I said that I liked that game and I was looking forward to his North Africa Zockbon game, which is coming. But he said that when he designed The Legend Begins and all its scenarios, he says he doesn't remember that he actually ever played the full campaign, which doesn't really seem to have hurt things, as reports are that campaign is great. The gang from Revolution Games was also at the convention with a few goodies to show off. First, they had a pre-production copy of Grand Havoc, their next release in the Blind Sword system, set on during the Battle of Perryville. I borrowed it for a quick unboxing, guerrilla style, with my phone. You can find it on the website. Very different map this time around, as the ground is dry and parched, but all the Blind Sword goodness that you're looking for. They also had a pre-production copy of their upcoming World War I air game, Eagles of the Sky. Folks were drooling over this all weekend, as it is stunning. In a big departure for Revolution, it comes in a 3-inch box with a mounted map, beautiful cards and counters, and 2 rule books, one for engagements and one for the campaign game. I'll be doing an unboxing for this game as well, and then a deeper dive on the YouTube channel, as this game deserves to be seen for sure. And then finally, Steve Carey was there with his playtest copy of his next Blind Swords entry, which will come out after the Perryville game. This is on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. I sat in and playtested one of the scenarios and watched and commented on a couple of others as playtest went on most of the weekend. The first thing you'll notice that's new about this title is the map. It's a two-mapper, or at least it is when you play the full game. I think the first two scenarios can be played on single maps. The third scenario isn't too large, but it may straddle the maps. I'm not sure. In any case, if you're a Blind Swords fan like me, there's no shortage of designs in the pipeline. What's on the table? Well, I'm going to skip this time. If you're interested in seeing what I played at the convention, I'll have an article up on the website in a day or two after this posts, where I'll go over all the things I played and how that all went. But yeah, I'll just skip on to new games in the collection. I was lucky to buy a few used games this month, used but unpunched, so I'm feeling very happy with the prices I paid. I got Atlanta Is Ours, a GCACW game, as well as The Devil's Cauldron and Where Eagles Dare, all from MMP. And then from Compass, my pre-order of Prelude to Revolution came in. It's the follow-up to Prelude to Rebellion, although with a different designer, and is set during the Russian Revolution. And then based on a strong recommendation I read in a blog, I picked up the Shiloh game from Columbia. I haven't played any of their American Civil War block games yet, so perhaps I've opened a new can of worms for myself. And then, of course, while I was at GMT, I got The British Way, which I'd had on P500, their new multi-coin game, as well as Flying Colors, which is an older title that I've always wanted to try. I haven't had a new Age of Sail game since Wooden Ships and Iron Men, so I thought it was maybe time to see where the state of the art had got to. Okay, so let's move on to the interview with Jerry White. I'd met Jerry last fall at the previous warehouse event. At that time, I told him how much I enjoyed Atlantic Chase and what a fan of its rule books I was. I asked him about what he was working on next, and at that time, he only mentioned a game on the first submarines set during the American Civil War. But of course, all fans of Atlantic Chase were wondering if it was possible to port that system to the Pacific, and if so, how would that work? So listen to the interview as Jerry takes us there and explains his thoughts on that, as well as his history as a designer and gamer. Here's my interview. Okay, well, I'm here at GMT West Spring Weekend at the Warehouse with Jerry White, designer of Atlantic Chase, among other things. How are you, Jerry?
Very good.
A good convention so far?
As always, it's been excellent. Yeah.
You've spent most of the time demoing your new stuff. Do you ever get a chance to play when you come to these things? Or?
Well, actually, when I come to these things, yeah, I prefer to just play.
Right.
You know, because I spend so much time with my own games trying to do, just trying to figure out how they're going to work. Then when I get here, I see old friends because I've been coming here for so long. So yeah, I try to do as much other gaming as possible, but I have been doing some demoing, yeah.
Right, and you got a lot of design irons in the fire, so that must mean a lot of demoing or a lot of playtesting.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Are you from California? Is this your?
Well, I've been in the 21st century, yeah, for about, I guess, since the early 90s, yeah.
Right. So this is home for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
What's your sort of wargaming history? Did you grow up? Were you like a 70s or 80s gamer? And SPI?
Yeah, I would. Boy, now I'm going to have to do math to go back to when did I guess my first game was Victory in the Pacific, Avalon Hill.
Yeah, for sure. Great game.
And I was about 9, I think, 10. My dad brought it home, and it was just, it left me speechless. It was so incredible.
Right.
Because I had never imagined anything like that. And, ever since, that's what opened, that was the gateway drug, so to speak.
Named ships, the whole thing, nothing abstract.
Right. And I remember playing that to death. And very quickly, I was really into the American Civil War. So I very quickly took out, my family were very much into history. So I remember taking out maps of the Battle of Gettysburg and trying to create my own game on Gettysburg.
Right.
But I didn't know about hexagons yet.
Right.
So I just had areas, and I didn't know about movement points yet because all I had was Victory in the Pacific.
Right.
So I was trying to use that kind of system for Gettysburg.
You might have invented area movement all on your own.
Yeah, if it had worked, sure. But then my dad got me a game on Gettysburg, and it had hexagons, and that was just like,
And was
holy
it the old,
smokes. It was
not the first age Gettysburg?
No. It was the 77 one with the topo maps, very colorful.
Yeah.
So that was, man, I played that one to death.
You're known for like air games and naval games primarily, but have you ever designed any like land games or?
Yes, but I haven't published any.
Right.
I mean, if I were to count all the games that I have that I've designed over the years, there's probably more land games than anything else.
But they haven't been brought to publish.
No.
Is that because you're unhappy with them, or there's still like?
That's a good question because I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've been designing games for a long time, ever since I was a kid.
Yeah, right.
But it hasn't been that long that I've been trying to publish them. And I sometimes catch myself wondering, why do I want to publish them? Because it's not like it's my career. It's not how I keep a roof over my head.
Right.
I sometimes think, what do I get out of it? And there is some satisfaction, but I think what it is, I think what appeals to me in the publishing of the game is if there's nothing that's really in the market, either a subject, whether it's, say, the Doolittle Raid, or with Skies Above the Reich, what Mark Allstead and I, who I designed that with, we were looking for a kind of air game that could handle those large formations, very static formations of heavy bombers.
Yeah.
So if there's something unique or something that isn't there in the market, because there's so many Civil War games. I mean, how many Gettysburg games does the world need?
Yeah,
we both know it needs more. Yeah. Yes. So this is why I keep buying them and playing them. I know.
I bought a Gettysburg game last year. I bought.
Me too. I mean, I'm not ditzing, Gettysburg games or anything because I play them. I have them, but the market is saturated.
Right.
So I don't need to contribute to that. I think. So at least for publishing, although I have, designed some.
Well, here's a tangential question. I was talking to somebody else yesterday, and they were talking about the problem of another publisher, designer publisher, and talking about the problem of having somebody design a game that's a great game, a terrific game, and it's filling a hole, and that there's nothing there before, but it's on a piece of history that is not as well known, and so the game falls through the cracks a bit because people aren't attracted by the history. So it feels like there's a bit of a tension between something new and something familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's, if you're playing these kind of games, you're really into history. Probably you're not just interested in one topic of history, but it's probably pretty broad.
Right.
But for some reason, and I'm not a publisher, so I can't speak to the whole publishing side, because a lot of that seems mysterious to me in a lot of ways. But there's got to be, from the publisher side, really good reason why Gettysburg games and Battle of the Bulge games keep getting published and bought, because it's definitely a market. So that means that, the lesser known topics of military history do tend to fall through the cracks.
Right, yeah, no matter how good the game is.
Right, yeah.
Which is anybody in this hobby, as you said, we're into history, but we're also into games, and there's that tension between history and games, and I hate the thought of losing a great game going unnoticed just because people go, I don't know anything about that sliver of like what the Albanians were doing in 1821 or whatever it is.
Sure. Yeah, there's ever since I was a kid playing these games, I learned so much from the games. There would be this kind of leapfrogging where you get a game and then you're starting to read, and then or vice versa, and then
often that way though for me. I'd get the game and then read.
Yeah, me too.
And then
me too. Yeah,
maybe I need another game on this topic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And as a designer, often, and I know authors, it's often the same for them. That how does a new book get born? It's because the author, who's not an author yet, is looking to read about a certain topic, can't find anything on it, so they start doing the research and they wind up producing it. Sometimes it's the same thing with game design.
Games, yeah. In terms of games that you like to play, is there a certain designer that's sort of does the kind of your favorite sort of stuff? Or
wow, that's
I don't want you to piss off your friends.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to give favorite.
In all the designers you love, is there somebody who's got a little?
You learn as a designer. Sometimes you play games just to see what the designer has done.
I think they should.
Yeah. So I sometimes am very eager to get new games just for that reason. I'm an omnivore when it comes to games.
Yeah.
So I don't have a favorite. I have maybe a constellation of favorites.
Right.
And I've learned so much from so many different designers.
Right.
So I'd be hard pressed to pick one.
Right. Could you give me three?
Three. Wow.
I don't want to.
Okay.
I mean, for me, I have a favorite. My favorite all-time designer is Courtney Allen, who designed Upfront and Storm over Arnhem. And I think, why doesn't this guy get more love? He's like, he created two whole new things out of nothing.
Yeah, Storm over Arnhem. Yeah, I remember that as a kid. That was incredible. Yeah, that was a great game.
And now there's probably 50 area impulse games out there.
Yeah, it's a whole genre unto itself now.
It's just like CDGs, like Mark Herman inventing the CDGs and then going,
right.
Same thing with area impulse.
Exactly. Yeah.
And lots of games have tried to follow in the footsteps of Upfront, but it's a tougher thing to do.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my guy. But
okay, well, that's cool. That's very cool.
You don't have to answer the question.
Well, let me ask you, just to follow up on Arnhem, do you feel that the newer games bring something else to the original, or supplement the, or has it?
So there have been a variety of improvements on that first thing. Mm-hmm. Like in Courtney Allen's first one, in the Arnhem one, we switch back and forth. I activate an area and I do my thing, then you activate it until all the areas are done. Mm-hmm. By the time they got to the third game, they'd added the sunset rule where there's an impulse marker that goes up 1 by every time there's an impulse, and whatever the first die roll on an attack is, if it's lower than the impulse thing, all of a sudden that turn is over. So that was it. That was totally interesting.
Yeah.
And then lately, Mike Ranella, who does a whole bunch of things with
right. Yeah, he's terrific.
And he's really taken the area impulse game idea farther, and he's got this momentum thing where you might get 2, 3, 4 impulses in a row depending on what your roll is. So you never know how many goes you're going to get. So there have been developments to.
That's pretty nice. Yeah, that's pretty sweet. Yeah. Okay, so to go back to your question, if I had to pick 3, wow.
I'm interested because most of your output, like I said, is aerial or naval, and so I don't know if your designers are going to skew that way, or if.
I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about Richard Berg lately, partly because you come here.
Right.
And there's so many people have played Richard. He's just such a stellar
figure.
So
many people are telling you stories, right?
Exactly.
Like, I've had 2 people tell me Richard Berg stories yesterday.
Yeah, I wish I had one. I never met the guy.
No, me neither.
But I've had conversations this weekend about Richard Berg 2 or 3 times already, and I find myself telling people that I enjoyed reading his rules so much. I know there was a time where people were really ditzing his rules, but I always liked his rules.
A sense of humor in there.
There was voice. It's so hard to write a technical manual, which is what a rule book is, and put the author's voice in it. That is an achievement there.
I think that who's carrying that torch now is Amabel
Yes.
Emma
Yes.
Holland.
Right. Yeah.
Like her rules, the same thing. You're going to get her bitchiness or her or her sarcasm or
Yeah.
you know what she feels about what she's writing.
Yeah, very inspiring designer. You know, the topics that, and of course, I really tip my hat to folks like her who are not only doing the design, also the publishing.
Yeah.
Design is hard enough. I can't imagine trying to actually be the publisher. That is to me, that's the harder job.
Right. Yeah,
And to do both. Because you got to work the market, you got to know what the market is going to take.
And they've got their own business model that it looks like it's working for them.
Yeah,
and
I hope so, because I hope they keep going.
Letting her design the kind of game she wants to do, which sometimes are like, she sometimes seems to say, I want to make a game that makes you feel really uncomfortable and sad and think about things.
Yeah.
And she'll make that game.
Yeah, but she's also tapping into topics that are really very powerful and important and relevant. And she doesn't shy from moving away from wargaming, which I think, is, if I recall, I think that's how she started.
Yeah, their first game was a Brian Train game.
Yeah.
The Shelt game. And she designed Table Battles, which is, I think, maybe still their biggest seller. But and then you get games like Endurance, and you get That's
civil rights
game, right?
Yeah. The topics are Charlemagne, she's very inspiring.
So she reminds me of Richard Berg in that way, in that sort of, she's got a voice, no doubt about
it. Definitely. And, she is, I always, you have to pay attention to what she's doing, Yeah,
I follow her on Twitter just to see.
Yeah, she's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So Richard Berg, I'm going to put her, even though you introduced her, but yes, I would definitely, she's one of those that is in the constellation that I follow and have been inspired by. Boy, who else? I don't want to, there's so many designers here, I don't want to, piss anybody off or burn a bridge.
They won't even listen.
I don't think that's true. Yeah, people listen to your podcasts. I guess, boy, who else? Okay, how about this one? Dave Thompson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He is, he's got such a good nose for a topic. He also knows how to distill complexity into simplicity.
Exactly.
His games tell stories. He makes you see things that you ordinarily, like a conflict, start of World War II in a post office.
Right.
The idea that somebody's actually going to publish that, how is that going to sell? But it's an excruciating topic. When you think of, that was the door that opened up catastrophe that would go on for many years, especially in Poland. He's so good at making playable games. He, I think, is instrumental in growing the hobby. Keeping the hobby.
And he seems to be committed to that as well.
Yeah. So
without dissing us a Hex Encounter Grognards.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the Hex Encounter Grognard type is definitely, I think, willing to play his games. Certainly, and they get played a lot.
I'm addicted to. I know there was somebody who was talking about they didn't really care for the Undaunted series because it's not strictly historical.
Yes.
But I've played the heck out of Undaunted Normandy in the last 6 months. And me and my partner are just like, we just can't get enough of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah,
because of the stories.
Yeah, I have a friend who is exactly what you're describing, that there's no asymmetry between the order of battle on the German and the American side, so therefore Undaunted Normandy sucks. And I'm going like, look at the simplicity of the game. You have some things that are a little bit unusual from what you would expect in a Hex Encounter game, but I have introduced so many people at conventions, including conventions like this one, who have never played a Hex Encounter game, who are new to GMT as well as the hobby, pull out that game and, very quickly we're playing, they're having a great time, and they're going, so what other games are in this kind of genre?
Right.
And hat tip to the designer.
Yeah, and it's not... and it's not so simple that an experienced player like yourself is unhappy. Like I'm not really interested in entry-level games all that much.
Yeah.
But what I like is a simple game that is more of a gateway game than an entry-level game.
Yeah, because I mean, it's enjoyable to play those games because of the people you're playing with.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's not going to be Case Blue where you've got this monstrous expanse, which is wonderfully monstrous.
Yeah, that's all good, but a game like Undaunted is going to give you some surprise and like the card play and all that. It's like, oh my God, I really need a rifleman card, and I've got all these scout cards.
Exactly. Plus, you're done very quickly, and now you can play another game.
Yeah. Well, that's a great choice, and a really nice man. It seems to me. We got to get him to come out west at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'll let you off the hot seat.
Thank you.
Do you, when you get a chance, do you still play any older games, or are you constantly sort of in the time you do get to play, checking out new designs?
I mean, I'm always hungry for new stuff that's coming out. To the detriment of my wallet, of course. This is true of many of us, I'm sure. But actually, Mark Osted and I think a year ago we played Victory in the Pacific, which was very nostalgic, and it was nostalgic for him too. But that was fun. I like that design. That was
same here. I think that's one of the 70s games that's like still. Yeah. The reason they still play it at conventions.
Yeah. It has a big following.
There, just like
I'm not a very good player at it, though. I gotta say.
I don't care.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm there for the experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then I've just been reading the Ian Toll books, right? And so it's like, oh, now I got to play that again because it's like I've just plowed through this history. Right.
Yeah.
That's what books do to me with the games, for sure.
Yeah.
If you, in terms of like types of game you like to play, if you're not just searching out, seeing what's new out there to see who's lighting a fire, is there any do you have a favorite type of game to play? Or you said you were omnivorous, and I can relate to that.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, when I come to a convention, I'm actually looking for more Euro-ish, because this is a social environment, and I find that those games are simultaneously satisfying. You're trying to build your engine, and there's a bit of solitaire there, but there's something satisfying about that. But at the same time, you're talking, you're conversing. Games like Wild Blue Yonder. There's a lot of us here who play that a lot, and because we have played it for so many years, I'm not great at that game either, but I love the banter, I love the camaraderie. It's friends.
You play cards and talk, and
exactly.
Same with the guys playing Thunder Alley the other night. It's like just sit around and drive cars around the track, and
exactly. So when I'm here, I gravitate to those kind of games. But when I'm home, I like. I mentioned Case Blue. I don't have Case Blue, but I have a lot of the OCS.
Right.
I like playing that solitaire.
Right. Yeah.
I have some space. I lay it out. It could be a lot of maps. Over, by the time I'm done with it, there's a layer of dust on it because it's been up for so long. But it's a study. It's something. There's solitude in it. I get immersed in the history of it. So I gravitate to those, to higher complexity games, which actually I don't have that much patience to play with another person, which is kind of antisocial of me, I know, but...
It makes perfect sense. I find my best way to play those, I don't play OCS, but I play some of the bigger games, like Mark Simonich's U.S. Civil War or some of the BCS stuff.
Yeah, last year I played for about 3 or 4 months Mark Simonich's Civil War. It was just solitaire. Yeah. I was doing campaign after campaign after campaign.
I play it on Vassal, but via PBEM, so it's like every day or two I'm going to sit down for 20 minutes and do my turn, then get back. And it's like, it takes about a year to get through a game, but I find it super relaxing and really scratches the itch of getting to play a big game without having to sit hunched over the table for 8 hours.
Right. Yeah. And when you're, if you're going to play a game like that or something like it with somebody else, if you don't do the remote, which I'm not crazy about doing myself because I really like, if I'm going to play a game with a person, there's the spatial social aspect to that is so important. So you have to coordinate your schedules. You can only, if you're going to do it in person, you probably can't do 8 hours in a sitting.
No.
You know, if you have a job, if you got family, and so
Maybe
on.
2-hour or 3-hour chunks.
Exactly, and that, how long is that going to take? Imagine doing OCS.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to do third winter, you know, I mean, you'll be here for a decade.
Yeah. So you play it by yourself. I play a lot of those big games by myself too.
Oh, cool.
Just to see how for me, a big part of game, especially when there's no hidden information or anything like that,
Right.
just let her go. Because mostly, it's like why I kept buying games when I was a kid and I didn't have anybody to war game with, but I just kept buying them.
Right.
Because I wanted to see how they work.
Yeah.
And not just how the game worked, but how the history worked. Like,
Right.
That's a big draw.
Right.
In terms of your own designs, you've done all these. You're sort of doing naval games at the moment, but you've done a lot of air games. What first brought you into the Skies Above series?
Yeah.
Or
The culprit was Mark Osted.
right.
I wasn't looking to design that game. Mark used to live in my town, but he moved away recently. But anyway, so that came about because I was over at his place, and he has lots of designs, you know. He was a big B-17 Queen of the Skies player, which I never played, actually.
I did that, like when it came out in the 80s, yes, I had that game.
So I never played that one, but he was a big fan of that. He even got his kids to play it, which is absolutely crazy. So he was telling me about one of his designs, which was this, it was, I guess you could say, bombardment groups. You know, we're talking World War II, 1943, 44, and you are basically trying to assign various attacks, air raids on Germany and so on, and he referred to B-17 Queen of the Skies, and he saw my eyes kind of, you know, be blank, and he said, "You don't know what that is, do you?" I said, "I heard of it." So he goes, pulls it out, and he shows me what it is, and as we were talking, the little light bulb comes on, and I go, "That is the dumbest thing ever." Imagine taking such an interesting subject matter. You've got the B-17, you've got the 109s and the 190s, but who in the right mind would want to play the B-17? You're just getting attacked. What decisions are you making? You obviously want to play the 109 and the 190, where you got, you know, you're the offense. You're so interesting. We started talking about that, and there it was. You know, we turned that around, and now all of a sudden we expanded, and we said the B-17 by itself, no, because, you know, the B-17, the Flying Fortress, it was just a part of a whole. The whole was the combat box with overlapping fields of fire that were absolutely deadly. So it's a very static kind of spatial terrain up there.
Like 4.
Well, yeah, you have an element of 3 or 4, but then those elements are, you know, staggered in 3 dimensions to create this, you know, they called it the box.
The box.
That was really it was so dangerous that Allied fighters, by the time they could have those long-range escort, they didn't want to go in there. They would wait for the Germans to go through and come out.
It's like a three-dimensional version of converging machine gun fire, like setting up that.
You can think of it as a series of pillboxes in the air.
Right.
You know, if they're doing
and
their job.
Different heights.
Yeah, and the B-17 and the B-24 were heavy enough that they were, and given the fact that the doctrine, the training was to maintain formation for dear life so that they could maintain the gun positions and support each other. It's a very static terrain.
Right.
So what are the Germans trying to do? They're trying to loosen that up. Because if you can knock a B-17 out,
one out of it.
Yeah, now it's a sitting duck. So that's way more interesting than, you know, so that's where that was born. And we just thought that would be it. You know, we would be done with that.
And that was Skies Above the Reich.
That was Skies Above the Reich, and we were also designing Storm at the same time, but it was too huge. So we split them up. So they're really 2 halves.
Right, and it's just different part of the war?
Well, no, it's exactly the same part of the war, really, but it's one, Skies Above the Reich has B-17s, Storm has B-24s.
Right.
Which, of course, you know, when a German Staffel went up, they had no idea if they're going to be encountering B-17s or B-24s. Right. So really, we envisioned those two as being the same, but for marketability or whatever, and price, split them up. But we didn't want an expansion where you had to own one first.
Right.
We wanted, because we know GMT games often go out of print and they can stay out of print for a long time. So we wanted to make sure that both would be a standalone package.
Right.
Yeah, so we did that, and then we walked away. We were done. We were, quite frankly, we were pretty tired of it, because by the time you get a game done, both Mark and I, we were pretty exhausted with the subject. I mean, we were really into it for a while, but by the time it ships, we were just so done.
Do you ever play your game? I was listening to a podcast with Herman Luttman, and he was saying, like, I never play a game of mine once it's been published. It's like, I'm so done with it.
I don't even want to look at it.
Right.
I'm just so done. Yeah, it hasn't happened yet. I haven't played a single one that's been published yet.
Right.
So, yeah.
That says nothing about the game. That says more about how much time you've spent wrestling with it.
Yeah, because you really have to get immersed in it. You're doing so much reading to understand the history of it. And when it comes to those kind of air games, you're also studying the physics.
Right.
Because that's crucial to be able to interpret, the sources and so on. It's exhausting,
Right. So then you did some more.
Yes, yeah, because, I mean, Mark was done. He was so done.
Right.
But after Skies came out, there was a person by the name of Gina Willis who just really loved the game, which is really flattering to get somebody. She went on BGG and saying she loved it and everything. She thought it'd be great for the Battle of Britain. Mark and I had already studied that because while we were in development, because we thought, could this system be used elsewhere? Because at that time we were really enjoying it.
Right.
But we concluded no, because this system is based on the heavy bomber, the static combat box. Battle of Britain had medium bombers. They were more maneuverable. They were still flying in formation,
like
but
the Dorniers and the Henkels.
Henkels and the 88, Ju-88s, and also the Stukas.
The Stukas, right? Yeah.
Early on, until the Germans took them offline. But so we concluded that this difference between the heavily armed Flying Fortress compared to the armed Heinkel, the maneuverability differences. It's not like the Heinkel was super maneuverable, but basically when things were really going wrong for the German bombers, their formations broke up far more easily than the American formations. And also, more importantly, the Messerschmitts and the 110s, if they were chasing the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, they would chase right through the formation.
Right, they weren't afraid to.
Exactly.
Go through the box.
So it was a very different doctrine, very different aggressiveness from the. Not that the American and the British, the RAF, weren't also aggressive in 44 and 45. But you see it spatially, really be applied in a different way in those formations. So we concluded, no, it's bad. It's not going to work. So we said, no, we're not going to do it. But Gina said, nope, you're wrong. This can work. So Gina and I kind of had a back and forth on BGG, and I tried to explain to her why. She said, I think you're wrong. So she winds up doing a design. She does a Vassal module. She puts it out there. People are playing it. And then she comes here to one of the weekends. There was a weekend I couldn't actually go to. She goes to Gene Billingsley and Mark Simonich with this, and she had made all the components, because she is a great writer. She can do graphic design. She's a great designer. She had the whole package.
Right.
And they're going, Battle of Britain game? Like, that is the topic we want to publish. And I'm going, holy crow. This is bad. This is very bad. Because she was, how it is when you get excited about a game, it's all shiny. So she wanted to be faithful to the system. Right. So she made very few changes except what was absolutely necessary. And the thing is, Mark and I knew that even if it works, it's not that great for Battle of Britain.
Right.
So it was almost like self-defense. Mark said, let her do it. Just let her do it. She's done all that work. But it just kind of bugged me a little bit. So we started emailing back and forth. And I was trying to say, I think you need to do more with medium bombers. They have to loosen up faster. So what if you did tiles? And she, to her credit, she's so open-minded. She said, that's not a bad idea. So let's try it. So she's trying that. And then, she had this mechanism where the 109 would chase the RAF pilot through the formation. And I said, that's very good. That's exactly what you need to do, but there's not enough of it. Because, you could have an entire Stoffel trying to tangle with the Spitfires and so on. So and I said, I think the Battle of Britain is really about fighter-on-fighter combat, as opposed to, say, 1943 Schweinfurt, which was just fighter against bomber. So you need to shift the complexity from fighter on bomber to fighter on fighter. And she said, that's a good idea. So gradually, she was not defensive,
Which is key, right? It's like...
Absolutely. And the thing is, I was so done with Skies Above the Reich, I did not want to defend that system. I didn't want to work on that system. But gradually, we were starting to design something different. And so I think I said, do you want to do this together? And she said, yeah, that would be great. So that's how that was born, Skies Above Britain. And more recently, Terry Simo, who did Bloody April.
Right. He's an air guy too.
Exactly. Well, he's a pilot. Yeah. I mean, he was in the Air Force for 37 years. Right. After Skies Above the Reich came out, he emailed us, Mark and I, saying, "This is great. I think it's going to work for Guadalcanal." And we said, "No, go away, go away," because again, we were so done. But then after Skies Above Britain came out, he did it again. He's emailing Gina and I, and at that point, Gina said, "I am so done," because it is, yeah. But she's got Glorious Chance for Legion. She's designing other things. Right. So Terry, and I started emailing back and forth.
So this is like Cactus Air Force stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So he's saying this is just going to work perfectly, and he's got these ideas. So now we're working together. I don't know if it's going to come. You don't know until you get far enough. But right now it's getting pretty exciting, which is great. Because that's what you need. You need that spring in your step to really get, I'm starting to read on the subject matter, which is a very good sign.
Right.
And he's pretty excited about it. And then Ken T is very interested he's interested in a lot of stuff. He is the designer of People Power.
Yep.
The coin, which is going to, which is going to come out very soon. Yep. He's telling me that this system, Skies Above, is going to work for Japan in 1944-45. So we're kind of exploring that. I don't know if it'll come to anything, but yeah, so people come to me, and I like working with folks. It makes it far more interesting. It's more social, and I learn from them.
Was the fact that when Gina came to you and she originally was slavishly devoted to your original design in a way, the fact that she was open to changing it, was that the key to what got you go like, okay,
for me,
if I'm going to work on this some more, it can't be the exact same thing I just did, right?
Yeah. And the thing is, she is a good enough designer that if it would have ported over without major change to the system, I would have just shaken her hand and say congrats, because she understood the system really well. When you look at that prototype, I mean, but because it was going to be different, we needed new mechanisms. We need to morph the system. That's what got me really interested.
Well, and when people think of the Battle of Britain, they think of the Spits and the 109s. Even though there was all the bombing damage that happened, people really are thinking about those snarling dogfights.
Yeah, right. But the key to the Battle of Britain was that the RAF pilots had to get into the bomber formation. So that meant that the escort had to keep them out. So the real key, because once they got into the bomber formation, although they couldn't necessarily knock down a lot of bombers because they just didn't have that firepower, they could very easily disrupt the formation. So if they could do that before ordnance was dropped, and they had that fantastic information system with radar and the coast watchers and so on, that was very effective. So it was, so what we tried to do in Skies Above Britain is really focus on the contest between the RAF squadron and the escort. The problem was once you make contact with the raid, you've intercepted the raid, congrats, now you've got this cloud of escort. How do you get through that?
Right.
So that is the fundamental idea of Skies Above Britain. And then the secondary thing has to do with formation. That's where there's consistency between Skies Above the Reich and Skies Above Britain is formation. And in the first one, it's all about the bomber formation and its integrity. If you can rough up that formation, create disorder in that formation, you're going to succeed. For the RAF in Skies Above Britain, the formation was a fighter formation. It was basically the Vic. The squadron was organized in the Vic,
right,
and the Germans had the swarm.
Right,
so basically, although the planes were on par with each other, at least the 109 was an equal to the Spitfire and the Hurricane within certain limits and parameters. Yeah. I think the Spitfire, was probably the superior plane, but only slightly. The Hurricane, I think, was a match for the 109. They were different. There's different things they could do. The pilots were about equal, I think, overall, if throughout the course of the Battle of Britain. But where the Germans had an advantage was formation.
The swarm was
and the British knew that, going in, because they had experienced it over France. But it was too late to do anything about it, because to change doctrine means you got to change training. And they didn't have time to do that. Only a few squadron leaders who had figured out that the swarm is the way to go, they started training their own pilots during the battle to do that. And we include that in Skies Above Britain. It's this ace ability that we call the innovator ability, where if you have a squadron leader that has that, you can ditch the Vic and do the swarm. But the German disadvantage, of course, was range. The British had the home field advantage. Yeah. They had fuel advantage. So
and they're going to recover down pilots.
That's true. Yeah, that's
so
another
one. Recycle the manpower.
That's right. Yeah. Before and after the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe really took a hit.
I'm a big World War I plane fan as well, but I find all air fans are sort of geeks for the little tiny things that distinguish planes from one another, like
right.
Yes, I agree. The Spit was probably better. It was faster. The Hurricane could take a little more damage, or whatever it is.
Right.
Do your games address that at all? It's because I look at say what's his Lee Brimacombe Wood's flight leader is
wing leader.
Wing leader. He really, in lots of senses, he says in that game, there wasn't a lot of difference between a zero and a whatever. It's like he says, we like to geek out on it, but
right, yeah, and I feel the same way. But I think Wing Leader is such an excellent design. He is so good at figuring out scope and scale of a game, and then pursuing a design in such a rational, artistic way. That side view was such a simple but dramatic move, and all the rules, the whole thing follows through on that, including the art, and it's brilliant. It's really very smart. But I think with him, although he may say that, he does allow for these small differences. They're numeric, like he boils it down. He's another guy who knows how to take complexity and boil it into simplicity. And Wing Leaders is a testament to that. You've got these, aircraft cards that give the stats,
those cards.
Yeah, they're beautiful and they're so easy to work with. You've got your speed, how it can climb, it's turning. So he boils it down to those categories. He assigns numbers, I think it's like 1 to 6 or 1 to 5. And so you get that comparison, and everything is based on that, So, and that is just so clean, such a great system.
That thing that he did where we're looking at a side view instead of the, so many air games, it's top-down view, and it's all about maneuver.
Right.
And his big thesis is the main maneuvering was gaining altitude and then taking the energy you have there.
Right.
and turning it into speed or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic example of taking a concept and then following through in a design.
Yeah.
And he had, it must have taken him, I've never met him, I never spoke to him, but I can only imagine there had to have been that moment when he had to have the courage as a designer to jettison a lot, because there's, the horizontal element, the horizontal dimension was also crucial to air combat and air interception. But he just collapses it, and he had the courage as a designer to do that. And he is able to give you enough of the picture that it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And that is not easy to do. So hat tip for that one.
Yeah. So it's all air games. It seems that people are into air games. They're into all these details, and into like finding out what is designed. Like what is he trying to teach me about air combat with this? Going back to the games that what's his face did for Craig S. Taylor did.
Right.
Those kind of games. It was like, what's he trying to teach me about how a Mustang works? That was always what I was looking at when I was playing those games.
Yeah. I mean, with the air games that Mark and I, when we started with Skies Above the Reich and Gina, I mean, Mark he's a walking encyclopedia when it comes to the machines of World War II. Gina is incredibly knowledgeable on that. She can geek out with the best of them on that. I am not as knowledgeable, quite frankly, and this is why I have to rely on folks that I work with on that, and I also try to read as much as I can on it. It doesn't interest, those intricacies do not interest me as much. What interests me is the relationship between the human body and the machine. So it's kind of the anthrotechnological, I think, is fascinating. Just the idea that you have a body climbing up into this machine. They turn it on, it launches into the air. The precarity of that, and then they're trying the organization of it, because it's not just one machine, it could be hundreds of machines that are trying to fly in unison in some kind of formation. That organization in a three-dimensional space is insane.
Absolutely. And then when you think of those guys, it's like, you got to try and land on a carrier at night. It's like
crazy.
And you've never done it before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, in Skies Above, both with the games in the Skies Above system, but especially in Skies Above Britain, we were very keen to add in that human element as much as possible. So we have, fatigue in there and some other things and various unique abilities that some pilots might acquire. And the fact that you could have a veteran and a green flying next to each other. Maybe the veteran is trying to, shepherd the green guy a bit. I think that's where it's really interesting to me. I'm less interested in the caliber differences between this and that. Not that they're trivial, because a technological advantage could be catastrophic.
A lot of those games, though, too, were like primarily just dogfight games. So it was like, what does this plane do against this plane? And so then those things come into play in a different way than when you're going, how do these two interceptors make it through the swarm and get at the bombers, right? That's a whole different level. It's like sort of opening up the lens one stop on your camera.
Yeah, and the other thing is that what Mark and I decided at the very beginning was that we can't do a simulation. We can't do a flight simulator.
Right. Computers are where it's at for that at this point.
Exactly. You can't capture the dynamism, the kinetic energy, the feel in cardboard and paper and little counters and even blocks and stickers. So we didn't even try, so you don't have that kind of, maneuvering that you might get in, things like what you were just referring to, or was it J.D. Webster? Things like that, which is a fantastic game. You could talk about learning. I remember playing that and learning so much about the machine, about flight, without seeing any actual movement. It's so incremental, but it's so detailed.
It's funny you say that, because I remember how much fun I had as a kid with Richthofen's War, because of the differences in the planes and stuff and flying those around. And then Avalon Hill brought out Knights of the Air, which was a way more precise flight model. And I was like, I'm not playing this. This is I want to. I don't know. It's just like there's got to be a trade-off between the fun, the physics, and the fun there somewhere.
Yeah,
right?
It can be too much of a good thing.
Yeah,
but I often will, tackle a game, enjoy it without actually playing it. Not that I haven't played the Webster's games, because I have.
Yeah.
But for exactly what you're talking about, it's a little bit. You spend 2 hours and you play 2 minutes. I know folks who would that is paradise,
right.
To be able to have those 2 minutes where you're so absorbed in those 2 historical minutes.
Right.
I can appreciate that and I can understand that. And I did it, a few times. I don't feel I need to do it again. But I'm happy that I have done it, and I learned a lot from it.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of air games where the game takes way longer to play than what the engagement would be.
Of course,
that's for sure.
of course.
That's just the way it is. I don't know, my perfect balance is I need the story to emerge. That's what I need, because there is something, especially when you go back to the World War I stuff, where it did feel like there was this weird sense of chivalry in the air or something. I don't know. There was just something about that where, talking about that human thing you said about like flight had just been invented, and then they're taking guns up into the air with them in these completely new contraptions.
Yeah, it is just crazy.
Yeah.
No, when you think about that, how new the tech was, and
some of the first planes in World War I, like where they still had the propeller behind them.
Yeah, and they're carrying pistols.
Yeah.
They're dropping stuff.
And then they bring the machine guns in, and then they were shooting off the propeller. They had to figure out how to sync the machine gun with the rotation of the blade of the propeller, or mount them up here where they can.
Yeah, it is a fascinating topic.
Well, let's forget that, since you haven't designed one of those yet.
No.
Well, let's talk about Pacific Chase, or not Pacific Chase, which you're currently demoing here, but let's talk for a minute about Atlantic Chase, because that game feels like when I was talking about Courtney Allen earlier, I felt when Atlantic Chase came out, I felt a similar sense of, wow, this is an innovation. This trajectory business. There's been so many naval games that have scratched their head, broke their head against the rocks, trying to figure out, how do we do the thing where we don't know where the other guy is? There's the double blinds, there's just a million systems. And you came up with this trajectory system that was like, oh, this is how we should do it. I mean, where did that come from? Where did you...
Well, there's lots of naval games out there, a lot of good ones. But the model tends to be like you just described, is you kind of have this often hidden movement, and it's very incremental. So what I mean by incremental is that, I'll move, my task force moves 1 space, maybe 2 spaces, maybe 3 spaces, and now it's your turn and you're moving, and you're getting immediate information from that. So there's that, which I've been dissatisfied with for a while, because it's not historical, depending on the time period. It might be more relevant today, given the information systems that are available to the navies.
But World War II not.
World War II not so much, even with the wireless, as the British called it, radio and so on, because of radio silence. The convoy
you're giving away your own.
Yeah, that would be suicide for a convoy to constantly. Can you imagine every day or every hour, depending on the scale of the game, that it's portraying, that the convoy moves, say, 50 nautical miles, and now radio's back saying we just moved 50 nautical miles and here we are. Absolutely insane. What is that portraying? That's crazy. So this means then that the enemy They're doing it so the enemy doesn't know, but the effect, the implication is that your own team, your own side, does not know where their convoy is at any given moment unless something goes wrong.
Right.
So as soon as, say, there's a ship that is in distress, that's information.
And that's kind of we call it the trajectories, but it's because neither side knows where.
Correct.
Where
it's crucial. Yes, exactly. Neither side knows.
It's not like you put this trajectory out there, but you secretly know where your ship is, or your task force is on that trajectory.
Right. Yeah. You shouldn't. Yeah. You don't have that knowledge.
Right.
So once you embrace that idea, the next move was geometry. Because we're so used to, and representation. So there's really two things there. So by geometry, we're so used to points in space. So with hex encounter games, for instance, or even area games, I have this piece, whatever it is, it might be a block, it might be a square, a rectangle, if it's a ship, and here it is, and I can tell you exactly where it is.
Right.
This
Victory
ship,
in the Pacific. This is where it is.
This is where
the Enterprise is. Yeah.
But the thing is, how do you disrupt that knowledge? Double blind. That's one way to do it. I can put a screen so you can't see my side. Mm-hmm. I can't see your side. But the problem is, with that, I can still see my side. I shouldn't be able to see my side because they're radio silent. I know when they launched, and I know where they're going to, but I don't know at any given moment how far they actually are. I can estimate it, but maybe, there's a ship in the convoy that is slower for whatever reason.
Lagging it, right.
That's right, yeah. Or maybe they diverted their course a little bit before they had good reason to do it, or maybe a mistake was made.
Well, yeah, right.
All the above, you can't know this until you get some information. So this is where geometry comes in. Instead of that point, think about what a point is. A point, is this indivisible thing perhaps, but if you have a lot of them,
it's a line.
Then it's a line.
Right.
And what is that?
A point is only a moment in time. A moment in time.
Correct.
On that line.
So let's just cut to the chase, if you pardon the pun, and put all the points together.
Right.
Because it's got to go through all these points. Let's represent them all at the same time.
Right.
And we are collapsing in some way space and time that way. That's fine. And, years ago when I first started with this, that's how I pitched it, which I learned talk about somebody who's bad at marketing. I started saying, this is a game where space and time, you play around with space, and people would it was so abstract and so obtuse, people would their eyes would glaze over and say,
up, egghead.
yeah, exactly, this is a dumb idea. This is not going to be fun. So I said, okay. But yeah, so you have a line. That's what a trajectory is. And you basically have a segment of the line in each hexagon.
Right.
So now, once you have that, now what you're doing is you're giving the player some information. And now if you have the Bismarck knows that there is a shipping lane. Where would the Bismarck like to intercept a convoy?
Yeah.
They can't know exactly if the convoy is going to be there. They might come too late, they might come too early, but they've got a pretty good information that convoys are going back and forth through there. So do you want to do it close to the port? You want it where it's probably going to? Do you want to do it where it probably launched from? Do you want to do it under the air cover of the enemy? So now you're just speeding things up, and now the German player can create their own trajectories to try to determine where the battlefield's going to be. Because the real thing that I was mostly interested in was how historical leaders, those leaders who seem so effective in comparison to those who seem ineffective, one of the things that distinguishes those from each other are that the really effective leaders seem to have ability to determine where and how battle will happen. If you can bring the battle to bear in a way that is advantageous to your own forces, you succeed. And I actually started with the American Civil War, with ground combat at the operational level. Why was Lee able to recover over and over again from a bad situation and become victorious? A lot of it had to do with him being able to determine where battle would take place. And where he tended to fail was when he was unable to do that, like at Gettysburg. He was totally not in control there.
He didn't. it seemed like he was like, oh, I just want to have this fight and get it over with.
Yeah, well, he didn't know exactly where the enemy was. He just all of a sudden knew that it was very close. So he had to, bring everybody together. Right. The roads led to this one town, and he was hoping to get there. He actually didn't want to go there. He wanted to go to Cashtown.
Right.
But anyway, so
he didn't want to go there either. But
correct, right?
Buford, I think it was like, no, this is like, if
found the enemy.
Yeah, let's
They're
do it
right
now.
here. Yeah. So that's what I was trying to get into, and I actually wanted to design a Civil War game that was off of this, and I did design it. But it was overly complex because of terrain and some other things.
Right.
So the reason why I went to Atlantic Chase was because I needed to simplify, and I wanted to take away terrain.
Right, so yeah, exactly. So you're just on one surface.
Correct. I mean, you got weather, and that could be argued as, terrain-like, but it seemed to me simpler. So I had these convoys, and so anyway, that's how that came about.
It's amazing. And then the other amazing thing there's a couple more amazing things. I think of that game as also the sort of current state of the art for how to write a rule book and either a playthrough book or a tutorial book or whatever. Like there's a lot of discussion all over the war game world about how to write good rules, and I'm a big fan of rule books that can be used as references. Like the rule book is something I should be able to go back to later.
Yeah.
And if that means it doesn't teach me the game as well as another thing, well, I'm only going to learn the game once, but I'm going to keep going back to that thing. But you did it in a way that it seems like you managed to both teach the game and make a really great reference.
Well, thank you. That's very flattering. I'm glad to hear that. I don't know if it works for everybody. I doubt it does, because I think everybody learns differently. I mean, to be honest, my favorite kind of rule books are the very short ones, that are very tight, but also have the good references.
Yeah.
Because the way I learn a game is I just, I open the box, set the rule book aside.
Same here.
Set it up. Okay, I'll set up something. Hopefully, I can find the setup right away, and then I just start playing. Sequence of play. Because I can't remember. My memory is not so good that I can read a rule book and remember everything. I remember through doing.
That's exactly how I learn a game. I set up the first scenario. I glance through the rule book. I set it up. I go to the sequence of play, and then just chug my way through it and go to the rule. That's why I like a reference rule book, and those rule books that are just big paragraphs of text. Well, I just can't find the rule within the paragraph.
Yeah, but I think everybody's different, though. There's no one rule book style that's going to work for everybody.
Well, I think Atlantic Chase might be.
I don't think so.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think so.
You get some complaints about it?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I suppose people complain about everything.
Yeah, well, I think the complaints are legitimate,
right.
because it might not work for everybody.
Yeah.
So, and I try to keep that in mind, that when somebody has got a question, I don't take the position that somehow you just need to go back to the rule book and read it again. Because there's a thread on BGG in the Atlantic Chase folder, for instance, about really, I think it's boiling down to a confusion about one word that I shouldn't have put in a particular sentence. And, it has caused some confusion, and that's totally legitimate, and mea culpa, there's that game has about 250 pages of documentation, which is quite a bear to put together, and then to try to do the copy editing, with mostly volunteers and so on. So of course you're going to have these kind of problems, slip through. You don't want them to. You do your best not to, but you can't satisfy everybody. There's just no way.
Well, and you're obviously responsive to that. I've posted questions about rules on BGG for certain games where the developer just replies and says, read the rule book.
Yeah, which isn't very helpful, because if you did read the rule book.
I did read the rule book.
And if it was clear to me, then, because I get that, when I'm a player, sometimes I'm reading the rule book and I go, even if people I know that when I know the designer and I know that they're smarter than me and they are, brilliant designers, and I'm going, I don't understand this sentence. And there's no example. This is why I try to put as many examples in, because I know I could write a rule, a sentence, but somebody's not going to understand it.
English is slippery.
It is, yeah. And so maybe show it in an example. That's one way to do it.
Yeah.
And so when I respond in BGG, I deliberately try not to use the same phrasing I used in the rule book, because I assume that didn't work.
That didn't work right.
Yeah.
So that game was a big success.
Well, thank you.
And people love it. I was down here 6 months ago. I saw you, talk about what you were doing next, and you talked about the early days of submarines in the Civil War, and it's like, okay, he's doing a submarine game next. Oh, that's totally interesting. We're all wondering about it, like a Pacific version. Is a Pacific version of Atlantic Chase possible? Oh, it doesn't seem like it would be, because aircraft carriers are a whole different thing than capital ships and convoys, and so Jerry White he's looking at submarines now, and then I come here, and what have you got on the table but a demo of Pacific Chase? It's like, how? And you told me before we started talking today, you said you'd been working on this for like a year or more in the past. You were just keeping your cards close to your chest last fall.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, this isn't my profession. This is not how I keep a roof over my head or food on the table.
Right.
It's something I enjoy. It's an extension of the hobby. So, when I have some spare time to work on game design, I work on what interests me at the moment. So I'm not really, and one of the great things about working with GMT is they're not, I don't have a schedule where I have to keep, I try to make as few promises as possible. And once a game goes on P500, I feel responsible, both to the company and to people that may be wanting to order it, that
right.
I need to see that through. But until it's there, I have several designs that I periodically take out and enjoy working on, tinkering. I read some more, and Pacific Chase was one of those. So I think it was back in 2014 is when I started working on Pacific Chase. Because that was long before Atlantic Chase was on P500.
Right.
So I thought I had gotten Atlantic Chase to a point where I thought this was working, and I thought, well, could it work in an environment where you have aircraft, so many aircraft carriers and so many planes that you could have as many as 300 aircraft in the air.
Right, because also land-based air is...
Yeah, exactly. Air was crucial in the Atlantic, but the sheer scale of aircraft in the air in 1 or 2 days was not close to what was going on in the Pacific. So that seemed to be another challenge, just to test the system. So started working on that little by little, and 2014 gave way to 2016 and so on, and I went back and forth between those two, and then decided that, okay, I think Atlantic Chase might be interesting enough, and maybe I got everything, because Atlantic Chase was, as you said, was kind of different. There were so many things that weren't working for so long. I finally thought, wow, I think this might actually be playable by somebody without me being there trying to explain stuff. So I left Pacific Chase Go and to focus on Atlantic Chase. And I think just after Atlantic Chase got published, there's another designer in Quebec, Marc Rodrigue.
Yeah,
who is
and Tomahawks.
Fantastic designer.
Yeah,
talk about a talented designer.
My
Holy
countryman.
Smokes. Yes, he's amazing.
Yeah.
Bayonets and Tomahawks, that was the game of the year. That was brilliant. Anyway, he contacted me after Atlantic Chase, because actually both of our games shipped at exactly the same time.
Right.
So he's a very friendly, personable guy. When our games were shipping, he emailed me and said, we're like, fellow designers getting our games published at the same time. So we had a back and forth, and we both pre-ordered each other's games. Right. And so we're playing each other's games. And he got so enamored with Atlantic Chase that he designed a Coral Sea game using the system. within a couple months.
Right.
I mean, that's, and he zeroed in, so the scale is different.
Right.
He has air units. There's a little bit more complexity, but he's also very faithful to Atlantic Chase, the system. And he sent me the files, and, I printed it out, I played it a bit, and, I'm going, holy smokes, this is great, this works. He's got a lot of projects. He's a very interested guy, and like me, he doesn't keep a roof over his head by game design. He has a day job. So since then, he got interested in other projects, but he may resurrect that. But that got me interested again in Pacific Chase, which is a much larger scale. So my version of Pacific Chase, because he was also using that term, Pacific Chase. So there's kind of two games now that kind of had the same, but I think we'll find a different, if he carries through and really wants to do that game of the Coral Sea, and he's also got Midway and so on, I could see a series of smaller scale, like battle games.
His is more like battle games, and yours is a wider
Exactly.
lens.
Yeah, mine is far more operational, kind of flirts a little bit with the strategic. His is operational and flirts with the tactical. So different scales, different scope. The scope is only a few days. Mine is, several months.
Right, like the latest game from VUCA, the Task Force game.
Yes, yeah.
Which is like
talk about a beautiful game. Holy smoke, those guys are amazing.
Those guys do great components.
Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Pacific Chase that I brought here that you're referring to is has the scope and the scale more or less of Atlantic Chase. So the map it's one map, and it goes from Pearl Harbor to just barely kisses Japan, and then it goes from the Aleutians and just barely touches Australia.
Right.
In terms of time and scope, it starts in December 41 and it ends in the summer.
And it ends in the summer of
42.
And it's because 42's got like some of the great battles in it for sure.
Yeah. Well, the key there is that the Japanese doctrine, their tactics changed after Midway.
Right.
So if you go past that, depending what has transpired, especially if you're playing a campaign game, the rails can start to come off. That you get very atypical, very unexpected, and hard to swallow outcomes if you go too far past that.
Right.
And I'm not covering the Philippines or anything that are further west. So it's just really the American carrier raids. Basically, the shtick here is that after Pearl Harbor, Nimitz comes in, and then he is faced with the situation where he's got carriers, he's got cruisers, not much in the way of the larger assets. Doctrine up until that point was focused on the battleship as your primary weapon in the decisive battle. That's gone, so he knows.
That's gone, but not everybody knows it yet.
Yeah, well, the Americans learned it. They understood after Pearl Harbor the power of the aircraft carrier. The Japanese, curiously, hadn't completely learned it.
Which is so weird.
Yes, they were still thinking that,
they built Yamato or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. They were just trying to reduce the disadvantage they had in battleships, which was created by various treaties prior to the war.
Right.
And that would give them time, and it would also allow them, hopefully, to persuade the U.S. to negotiate a peace, or at least some kind of stalemate. So your game starts at Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
And are there scenarios that start later, or is it?
Yeah. So, the scope, there's a campaign. I'm mostly right now working on the campaign that will go from December into the summer. But within that, there will be a discrete number of scenarios that deal with a variety of situations that involve the carrier raids. Because when Nimitz was, during those few months, Nimitz's job was to make sure that he kept the communication lines open to Australia. And then at the same time, keep the Japanese busy. If he could keep the Kido Butai in the eastern part of the Pacific, away from the Dutch East Indies and, India and so on, that would be a success. So basically, you're looking at a series of different raids that the Americans did on airfields, islands, and so on that culminated in April '42 with the Doolittle raid. And the series of those raids prompted Yamamoto to really emphasize the idea that the American carriers have to get neutralized, which then spawned things like the Midway, initiative. Although that was on the books before, in planning before the Doolittle raid.
It just went up the priority list.
Correct.
Yeah. And when you say Kido Butai, that's the main Japanese strike force.
Yeah, 6 very large battleships, upwards of 300 planes, at full capacity, which was incredibly effective, as we saw at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and was the biggest strike force. Like, they had the biggest show on wheels for quite a while, and they didn't manage to do much more with it after.
I don't know. Wherever they commanded, wherever they went.
It's true.
East and west until really, May and June, when calamity struck.
Right.
But even then, what I find interesting, even in Yamamoto's plan for Midway, he was still thinking of his main battle force was not the carriers.
Right.
It was the battleships. He wanted to get rid of those pesky American carriers, and that would then secure Japan for about a year, if that had been successful.
I was watching your demo earlier, and the campaign game, for lack of a better word, it's an interesting campaign game in that it can branch different ways depending on the results of one engagement before the next. How does that work, or where did you get that idea?
Well, okay. Let me put it this way. We've all played games, whatever it is, hex encounter game, area game, whatever, military game, where there you are, you're looking at your reinforcement schedule, and you go, oh, okay, on turn 3 I get this brigade, and on turn 5 I get this division. It's a script, right? But the thing is, what bothers me about that is that, on turn 3, you're getting that brigade because you need it. Or on turn 6 or whatever, you're getting that because you need it. But what if during the game, you're actually doing really well?
And you don't need it.
Maybe they're not going to send you that brigade. But the game is very static. It can't really respond to what's happening on the battlefield, or whatever scale the battlefield may be. So I've always been interested in finding a way to make the players' actions and outcomes influence things like reinforcements, but also influence larger operational or strategic goals, because those change. So that's what this campaign system is about. So basically what I have is I've got what I'm calling operation panels, and you start with number 1 if you're doing the very first operation, which is the start of the campaign, which is December '42. And in the setup, you've got the American carriers are going out because they're ferrying aircraft to Wake, Midway. You got the Kido Butai is starting in the ocean. It's halfway across.
To the north, though, where...
Correct. Yeah, because Yamamoto is very clever going north. And you've got goals. Both players have goals. So the Japanese start with initiative, and each panel will present 2 or more goals, probably 2 or 3. So one goal is for the Japanese, wipe out, 6 American carriers.
Battleships.
Battleships. Sorry, battleships. Yes, not carriers. They don't
even exist yet.
That was a big faux pas. Yes, you are. Thank you for saving me from myself there. Yes.
That's okay.
So that's because that was the main goal of Operation AI, which was, or at least the first goal of Phase 1, was to knock out that strike force that the Americans had in battleships.
Right, because they're thinking the climax is going to be the battleship.
They have to defuse. They have to defuse that decisive battle. So that's Phase 1. That's the first goal. The other goal, the player doesn't have to do that. The player could decide instead, those carriers are out there somewhere.
Right.
So why don't I instead target them?
Try and
So that,
figure out where
depending
Halsey
on
is.
which one they choose.
Oh, the carriers are on two separate trajectories.
Yeah, because Halsey's got the Enterprise going one way, the Lexington's on a different mission.
Right.
So, you could instead choose to go after them, but
Right.
that'll take you down a different path.
Right.
So the Americans also have a couple goals, So if the Japanese player follows the script and goes for the battleships on Battleship Row, and things are set up perfectly for that. They have the mini subs there. They've got some spies there. So it's really at the start, it's set up for that. But not every player so far that I've seen have chosen to do that, because it's kind of fun going after the carriers, I gotta say.
Those carriers are going to come out and bite you
That's
in the butt
right.
later
That's
on.
right. But the thing is, the objective was to get those. No matter what happens, you better get, whether you get the carriers or not, you better get those battleships, because that's where the decisive battle is going to happen. So once you do that, that means you replace the operation panel. You basically flip it over, and the operation panel is kind of big. It's like, I don't know, it's about 4x8, maybe.
Kind of like a big index card sort of.
Yeah, it
size.
is. I don't know what the finished one is going to be, how big it's going to be,
Right.
how much graphics. It's going to depend on how much graphics there are on it and whether you put reinforcements on it or not. But you flip it over because you've just triggered that, because you satisfied that first objective.
Right.
That means during time lapse, you flip it over, and now you've got two more objectives. One is a major victory. If you can get an air base established on Guam, if you can get an air base established on Wake Island, you now are securing the perimeter. Major victory. But you also have a lesser victory. For the Americans, they get two more choices. One objective is, sink a Japanese carrier, or at least damage it, or do something else. And if they're able to do that before the Japanese can secure their victory, then you replace that panel with a different one.
Right. So if the Japanese, or if the Americans get one of their two objectives before the Japanese get one of their two, that determines what the next panel is.
Right. So, for instance, just to follow this through, let's say the Japanese, knock out, beat the heck out of Battleship Row. You flip the panel. So now the Japanese at that point don't care that much about the carriers, because the Kido Butai is vulnerable. It's low on fuel. So the main goal is to establish that defensive perimeter.
Right.
So historically what the Kido Butai did is that it swung around, it retraced its steps for a little bit, and then it swung towards Wake to cover the landing. And that was fairly successful before it went back to port and refueled. The objectives here are intended to encourage the player to follow that path depending on how things go. But the thing is, what if the American player, before the Japanese are able to do that objective and win that particular scenario operation, what if the American carrier was able to damage, maybe intercept or damage a Japanese carrier or the troop ships? After all, after Pearl Harbor in December, the Americans did make an attempt to try to defend Wake, but those forces were pulled back. But what if they didn't get pulled back? This is why we like those games. We like to explore these what ifs. So the American player can, try to do that. And let's say they do damage a Japanese carrier. It's unlikely, but what if they did? All of a sudden, the American carriers are now going to be priority number one.
Right.
So now you flip the panel, get a new one, and now you have new objectives, which means that the Japanese need to wipe out an American carrier.
Right, because it's changed the Japanese perspective.
That's right. And if the Americans also get a different objective, and maybe if they damage another one, now Roosevelt can at least tell the American people in a fireside chat that, we have some good news for you.
Yeah, right.
So that's the idea. And these panels also govern reinforcements.
Right, going back to your thing about, do you need the brigade or not? So
Right.
Do you need the reinforcement ships or not?
So in this case, when does the Saratoga come in?
Right.
If the Japanese don't do very well, the Americans don't need the Saratoga, so they're not going to rush it into, Pearl. So the reinforcement is contingent on what is going to happen.
That's a bit an auxiliary effect of that could be a sort of like a a rebalancing of the game as you go along.
Yes, exactly. So this was because
So
exactly.
there's no snowball where it's like
right.
I'm winning bigger and bigger and bigger all the time.
Right, because the big dilemma for a game designer, if you're going to do Pearl Harbor, I mean, how can you do that without it being a solitaire game? Who wants to play the Americans and watch their battleships get sunk? I remember when I was 9 years old and my father sunk my battleships in Victory in the Pacific, because I insisted, as the little brat I was, I had to be the Americans. And then I threw a fit when my dad, knocked out all my battleships. It's a great lesson. So, I'm trying to create a system where the player has a chance, even the American player has a chance to win, depending on the conditions at the time. The Americans were just undergunned in December. There's no way they could defeat the Kido Butai. But they could get a moral victory. They could they could change the conditions to set themselves up to be able to contend with the Japanese a little bit more successfully later. So basically victory is always contingent on certain circumstances and how you want to define what victory is.
Right, and in your game now, victory conditions shift as the situation shifts. Right. Which is kind of the way life works.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you about two other things about the game that are, because I think after Atlantic Chase there was especially among my American pals, there was a lot of great game. Now he's got to take it to the Pacific, where my grandpa served or where my uncle served or whatever. But how's he going to do it with all those planes? That's going to be so different.
Yeah, and if I made no changes to Atlantic Chase, it wouldn't work very well.
Right. So I imagine part of the thing was at some point the penny dropped and you went, oh, this is that had to be the key thing you were thinking about.
That was the big. That's the holdup. That's been the big holdup.
Right.
Because one of the things I did, this was Pacific Chase in 2016, was incredibly complex. I had air units. I had an elaborate carrier operation system. I liked it. I thought it worked really well, but it was just too much. It was way too much. And especially after watching people grapple with Atlantic Chase. Atlantic Chase is complicated. It takes a while for people to understand it and play it smoothly.
I feel like with that Atlantic Chase part, it's like, I'm not just trying to shine your apple here, but it's like sometimes when concepts are so new, it's not that they're complicated, but they're new. And I watch people grapple with that too. I see that sometimes with Carl Paradis' Absolute War. It's like people banging their head on the wall, but it's like, this isn't hard. It's just new.
Right. Yeah.
But you're still grappling either way.
Yeah. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. Some folks have told me that, and I know. That's why I created the tutorial actually in Atlantic Chase, because Mike Berticelli and his group. Basically, they knew how to play the game because they were asking me questions, and they were just verifying that this is how we do it, right? But the thing is, Mike, after a while, said, I think we know how to play the game, but we don't know how to play the game. We know how to do all the rules, but we don't know how to play the game. Because what are we supposed to do? How do we use these rules? I know that this action does this, but am I supposed to do this now? Because it's in Atlantic Chase, you have a menu of 10 actions, and when you have initiative, you can do any of them. So they're going, what do I do?
For me, that question, that's when I always go back to the victory conditions.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another reason why I'm doing these operation panels, to try to make those objectives clearer for the player.
Right.
So it says, this is, choose one of these two goals. Now go to the actions menu to figure out how you can achieve those goals.
Right.
So, but to go back to the air, because that's the big problem here.
That's the problem.
Yeah, that's a big problem here. So I had to make that one action a little more complicated. So so the airstrike, if you know Atlantic Chase, the airstrike is now called air intercept, which is what it used to be called before. Anyway, I won't get into that whole history of evolution there. It's a two-step process, but basically there are greater results possible if you have a lot of air power in your airstrike. So if you've got the Kido Butai, you got 6 aircraft carriers.
Right.
You don't just do 1 or 2 hits or do a damage. You can sink multiple ships with a single strike.
Right. So you can put 3 or 4 battleships in Battleship Row to the bottom.
Correct. Also, there's a little bit more complexity in terms of air bases. Now there's 2 types of air bases, big and small. There's something called a strike strength. You now have cap, you have got flak. Fairly simple.
Do you have to keep track of amount of strength that's in cap versus amount of strength on a strike, or it's not that granular?
Correct. Basically, you only have to worry about it if the air intercept manages to find its target, and then you're gonna take that last step. So you don't have to. I don't think it's onerous. From what I can tell, it's not. From watching people here, it doesn't seem to be too onerous. Basically, what you're doing is you're trying to determine whether you have advantage or superiority or a disadvantage in the airspace over the target. So at Pearl Harbor, they had briefly, the Japanese had superiority over Pearl Harbor. And if you can have at Midway briefly, for a brief moment, the Americans had air superiority over the Japanese task force, Kido Butai, and that was devastating.
Right.
It took, in a flash, those carriers went down. So there's a little more complexity there, and a little more complexity in the air bases. The port boxes in Atlantic Chase, you do what was called a completion action, which then could remove your force and save it. It could no longer be attacked. That doesn't really work here because the Japanese, basically you have Battleship Row, which is sitting in a port box. If I were to port that over, no pun intended, so obviously that something's got to go, and the easiest thing to do is just get rid of port boxes. So now instead we have this condition called in port. So you have a task force station, that's Battleship Row. It can't be engaged, so you can't sail in and attack it with surface ships, but you can air intercept.
Right.
And there's a slight wrinkle in evasive maneuvers, which is, if you know Atlantic Chase, that is a marker that sometimes appears. It can be used for a counterstrike. So there is a possibility, depending on what players do, what they decide, and a bit of luck, that you might be able to, the enemy's search for you could actually give you a clue as to where their carriers are, and you might actually be able to sneak in a strike, or at least do it simultaneously. Because what sometimes happened was that, these task forces would send out scout planes, and they could be spotted. So sometimes the information from those scout planes, although they identified carriers, enemy carriers, they might not be able to get that information back fast enough because maybe they are trying to avoid enemy cap, they're trying to save themselves, or their radio doesn't work or whatever, so there could be a delay, and their trajectory could give away where, the general direction where the task force is.
Right.
And sometimes, launches would happen before,
a counterstrike is launched before
correct,
a strike could be launched.
So there's a certain dynamism there that I'm trying to capture with a couple changes to the system.
When people think of Pacific naval games and the carrier thing, there's always so much hidden, but what's really not, among other things, but what's really striking looking at Pacific Chase is it's not hidden. If you have 4 task forces and I see those 4 trajectories out there on the board, I know that that's the task force that's got 2 carriers in it, that's just got capital ships, that's got a landing force or whatever.
Yeah.
Like there's no hidden information that way.
Right.
That must... Like when you present this game to game players to say, like, test this game, what do you get pushback on that? I don't think it's a bad idea. Don't get the wrong idea there. But it must players they're so used to going like, where's his task force? Where's his task force? Which one is his task force?
Right.
There must be a bit of like,
yes.
I don't get how this is going to work.
Yeah. I mean, with Atlantic Chase, there was pushback from some play testers right away because they just assumed. I actually found some play testers where, without even being told, they just assumed you have to hide your, the contents, the ships that are in your task forces. And I said, what are you doing? And they said, it can't work any other way. And I said, I think it might be able to. The thing is, it's a little trickier in the Pacific, but certainly in the Atlantic, at least my feeling was that Atlantic Chase was everything was focused on convoys.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of sending out the Bismarck was to go after convoys and then bring it into France so that the two battle cruisers could team up with the Bismarck and they could go out. The Germans knew where the convoy lanes were. That was not hard to figure out.
They're pretty much the shipping lanes.
Yeah, the shipping lanes. They knew where they were. They just didn't know where the convoy was at any moment.
Right. So we're back to your idea of the
Correct. So where does the Bismarck want to find them? They're not going to look for them under air cover, British air cover. They're not going to do it just outside of a port, a British port. That's suicide. So they're going to do it, where it's relatively safe for them. So again, the player gets to choose or is trying to decide and trying to shape the battle.
Right.
I want this battle to happen here, not over there. Whereas the British, they want the battle somewhere else. So you don't really need to hide the convoy from the player because the player knows that it's a convoy. They're not looking for anything else.
Right.
And the thing is, we tried it. I tried it myself long before it went on to P500, and we had newer play testers. But some play testers, I said, okay, why don't you try hiding it and see what happens? Because I was telling them, you're going to get ahistorical results because the system isn't meant for this.
Right.
So what you wind up getting is you get the British player faking a convoy. So you get a task force. So it goes along the lane, and there's no convoy in it. Instead, you got battleships, you got cruisers, you got an aircraft carrier. The British never did that.
Right.
They escorted, later on, they would escort some pretty hefty escorts to the convoys, but they couldn't afford to just let the convoy sit in a port while they were fleshing out the Bismarck. That is ludicrous. That is ahistorical.
You need to get the point is the convoys.
Correct. So if you actually hide that information, you're not making it realistic.
Right,
you're doing just the opposite.
So with that hidden, they were like sending out a battleship fake convoy, and then the real convoy might come later or something.
Now there were times when the German, the battle cruisers would encounter by accident. They would unexpectedly find a British battleship, sometimes even as a convoy. In the Norway campaign, the battle cruiser stumbled onto an aircraft carrier. So there were things like that would happen. But, the idea that there would be this elaborate ruse using all that fuel while, Britain couldn't afford to keep the convoys, not running for very long. When the Bismarck was unleashed during that very fateful campaign, Churchill did order many convoys to stop. But that was for a very brief moment. Right. That's because they knew they had identified the Bismarck was out.
Right.
And the thing is, they knew the Bismarck was out right away. There were contacts in Sweden, just as the Bismarck was rounding the Kattegat. It was identified, and then they were searching for it right away, before it left the inner roads of Norway.
And the cat and mouse, like this idea that there's a cat and mouse going on in the South Pacific between the carriers. They know how many the Americans know how many carriers are in the Kita Butai, and the Japanese know that the Americans only have 2 carriers at this point,
right?
Or so it's like there's no the idea of the cat and mouse and the ruse is kind of overblown in our imagination in some ways.
Yeah, you
don't know exactly where they are.
You don't know where they are, and the Americans didn't know. On December 6th, 41, the Americans did not know where the Kita Butai was. They know it was missing. They didn't know, therefore, if it was all together.
Right. So they didn't know this.
Correct.
The size.
Right.
Yeah,
so, that is, if somebody's going to say, yeah, I don't know if not having hidden information really is valid, I can understand that reluctance, and there is a point there.
Right.
But the thing is, once Pearl Harbor happened, by the afternoon, the Americans knew the Kido Butai was close by. There was no doubt, because there's no way that could have happened without all those aircraft carriers.
Right.
So, and the Japanese also knew that those American carriers are not in Pearl.
Right.
They're nearby somewhere. So the thing is, what I'm trying to do with Pacific Chase, especially with that first operation or first scenario, is to really deliver to the player, especially the Japanese player, Nagumo's dilemma. Because as we all know, I'm sure people who are listening, those grognards, there's such a debate about how long Nagumo should have lingered.
Right.
And he took flack for it from Yamamoto.
Yes.
Said, why didn't you stay longer?
Stay and press the attack.
Correct.
Yeah.
Nagumo's going, there's no carriers in Pearl.
Where
are they?
Right.
Yes. So, and all it takes, just look at Midway. One pilot, one dive bomber knocked out 2 Japanese carriers, 2 bombs.
Right.
Those carriers are incredibly fragile. So Nagumo, by retreating, in my opinion, I think Nagumo history has not been kind to him. I think it was reasonable, his actions to leave after 2 waves.
2 waves.
Yeah, I think it would have been excessively dangerous for him to stay. And also, he was starting to lose planes from flak and American resistance. That second wave took a beating.
Right.
So anyway, I'm trying to, hopefully this game can do what most games don't do very well, which is really get the Japanese player to feel that dilemma. Also, Nagumo had somewhere to go. Wake Island was on the agenda.
Right.
He was supposed to, some of his assets were supposed to cover the landing on Wake.
Right.
Which they did. So he had somewhere to go.
Right, because there was a whole, at the same time as Pearl Harbor, there's that whole unleashed thing across the rest of the Pacific
That's right.
he's going to go be a part of.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and Pacific Chase doesn't cover the Philippines or anything further west.
But that is happening.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, people are going to be excited to hear that this game is coming. You've kept your light under a bushel on this one for a while.
Well, the thing is, I don't want to get in a situation where I feel like something is expected of me, at least not until it's on P500. And the thing is, until very recently, I didn't know this was going to work.
Right.
I feel that this system now does work.
Right. It's like with Atlantic Chase, when you got the idea of the trajectory, the penny dropped. And then when you solved your issues with how you're going to do the air, the changes of the air with this, the penny drops.
Right.
And you go, okay, this is viable, right?
Right.
It's like, well, I think there's going to be a lot of people who like it.
Oh, thank you. That's I'm very happy to hear that.
There's I've talked to lots of people here already, and it seems like we're in a little bit of a renaissance of naval history games. Like people, like there's a couple of games out there that have come out in the last couple of years that it's like people are going, we need this space needs refreshing.
I think so. Like VUCA, has done 2 incredible games on this.
That's right.
The Fleets series, I think, is Encompass resurrecting that.
They're resurrecting that.
Yeah. So
and the reprint of Mark Herman's Big Pacific War. Which is kind of
quite an opus.
Yeah, and. It sort of does some of the same things that the VUCA game does, but you get to choose how complex a sandwich you want to bite into. Right.
Yeah.
It's like,
there's so much in that box.
Yeah.
Talk about a desert island game. If that's the only game you ever had, man.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But, sometimes you only want to play for an hour, too. So this is it. Well, is there anything else you want to tell me about what you're doing or about Pacific Chase?
No, I think,
to go back to the submarine submarine game.
Yeah, well,
still coming along?
Yes, so Infernal Machine is the one game that I have, the one new game that I have on P500.
Right.
So I'm doing that with Ed Ostermeyer, who is an amazing guy in Tennessee, who contacted me because he liked Enemy Coast Ahead games.
Right.
And it was very clear, he's a writer, and he just writes like crazy. He's an incredible researcher. and talk about enthusiasm. That's so necessary in a design project because it takes so long to carry through.
It's like fuel in a way.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, Infernal Machine is about submarine technology in the American Civil War in the 1860s. So talk about an obscure topic. And I am very thankful to GMT that they actually agreed to take it because it's got to be hard to market this thing. It's kind of niche.
These subs were like made out of wood and stuff, though.
No,
right?
they weren't. No, they were iron.
Yeah.
But what's really gets, I know Ed keeps going on and on about this when we talk every Wednesday by Zoom.
Yeah.
He just can't get over how pretty much all of the tech that we see in World War I and World War II, with a few exceptions like sonar, radar, and radio and so on, pretty much everything was in formulation in the 1860s. By both sides.
Right.
Thing is, when I started this, I thought we were doing a Hunley game. Hunley was the first submarine in military history to actually sink a ship. It didn't survive. It turned out to be a suicide mission because the crew never came back. But all that tech, everything from ballast tanks, snorkels, airlocks, air scrubbers, periscopes, propellers, rudder, all that tech, dive planes, all of that, and their combination was in development by these guys who were experimenting.
Right.
And even putting in boiler engines, even experimenting, trying to get a magnetic engine to work. All of that was there. Isn't the beginning of something fascinating?
Yeah,
the very start of it,
So is the game about building the machines, or is it about the fights between them, or
both? Well, submarines were the
Not
tech.
fight between them, but
the tech didn't allow one submarine to actually find another submarine, let
They're
alone
trying
fight
to
it.
sink shipping.
Almost stationary targets,
Right, yeah,
like
yeah.
blockade ships or obstacles, bridges, things like that. So the game is about both. So it'll be program instruction. So we'll start off with scenarios that build more rules as you go. So we'll have historical scenarios so that you learn how to run missions. Once you know how to run a mission, then we introduce the campaign game. For us, this is really about the campaign, where it starts at the very beginning of the war. You choose either Union or Confederate. We give you a location, maybe New Orleans, maybe Boston.
Is it a solo game then?
It's a solo game.
Yeah.
Then what you do is you've got to deal, it's a business. So you've got to get funding. We give you an investor. You have to recruit mechanics. You have to journeyman. Maybe you'll get lucky and get more investors. So then you start designing, you start building your fish boat, as they used to call it. They had many different names for this very new technology. And you can train, once you have a seaworthy fish boat, you train your crew. And we have a mission board, and there's several of them depending on the location. We've got Mobile, we have Charleston, we have the New Orleans area, up and down the Mississippi River, depending on what part of the war it is, and so on. Then when you're ready and when your government will allow it, there's asymmetry here because there's a very different experience from the Confederate versus the Union side. The federal government commissioned its submarines very quickly. So as soon as there was a seaworthy fish boat and the Navy decided that it was worth trying to use this thing, they would commission it, then they would take control of it and assign it. For the Confederacy, however, they were all about property, private property. They took that to a horrendous extreme, as we know. They were more hands-off, laissez-faire. So what you do as a Confederate player is you try to get a letter of marque, which gives you the right to go out there as a privateer to try to sink.
Like old-time pirating.
Right. Yeah, occasionally the game may, depending on what's happening in the larger strategic sphere, may actually assign you a particular target, but basically you're trying to, go for the bounty. Because the Confederate, basically it wasn't the Confederate government, but there were, I guess you could call them boosters today, but basically there were some Confederate business people who were offering huge rewards for sinking blockade ships.
Wow.
And that's what the Hunley was going for when it sunk the Housatonic. And if they had survived, they may have been able to cash in on $100,000 is what they were going for.
Because it was worth $100,000 because of the business that it was going to save. Right?
Correct, yeah, because they were hoping that, if you do enough damage to the blockade, you could push back or loosen up that blockade to get more blockade runners going through.
Yeah.
So
it was in their financial interest to post these bounties.
Right. So, what really excites, I think, both Ed and I about this is that this is I've always been really interested in the American Civil War. But this is going to show the American Civil War in a way that most war games never do. We're going to see the business side, relationship with the government, and also the tech side.
Right.
So we're pretty excited about it. It's coming along really well. So I don't know when it's going to be ready to publish, probably maybe sometime next year.
Is it on the P500?
It is. Yeah, it's got its numbers, but it doesn't have enough to actually print.
Right.
Because usually GMT really wants to have about 700 orders before they can be sure that they have enough cushion.
Right.
And not, lose out on it. But, I think it's going to be a different game, But I think players are definitely going to learn a lot about that early technology. They're going to learn, even if you know a lot about the Civil War, because you've been playing a lot of Civil War games at different scales, whether it's strategic, operational, or tactical, you're going to learn something. It's going to show the Civil War in a different light.
Right, because even if you've been playing some Civil War naval stuff, you're going to know mostly about gunboats and riverine warfare. And
exactly.
All that, Well, it sounds totally exciting.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks for talking to me, Jerry. This has been wonderful, and best of luck with the games.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored to be invited to the interview. I mean, thank you very much for that.
Cool.
Well, that was fantastic. Jerry had a prototype set up during the weekend, shepherded several players through the system. I watched a couple of times. We all have the same questions, where's the hidden movement? Where's the hidden task forces? How is this going to work? It turns out nothing is hidden. It all works great. I look forward to seeing this game come out and seeing what people's reaction are to it. It's very, well, just like Atlantic Chase, it's very different than any naval wars that you might be used to. In terms of bouquets, a real no-brainer this time. I have to say thanks to GMT for another excellent event. I reconnected with many folks I met last time, particularly Charles, David, and Joshua. And I met and played with some new faces. Like last time, the vibe was very laid back, non-competitive, really just focused on fun and comradeship, I suppose. And also, thanks to GMT for being so open. We were in their warehouse, but it was like totally cool to play games from other publishers and even demo games from other publishers. So, hats off to them for that. A real worthwhile event. I heartily recommend you check it out if you ever have the chance. Finally, parting shots. Just a quick one. It's hardly a parting shot, but we'll see. If, like me, you're a fan of Bruce Garrick's Wild Weasel podcast, you'll be delighted to know that it's finally back after a 2-year hiatus. The first episode back was great with 2 interviews. The first was with Herman Lutman, who's got more irons in the fire than he has fingers. Great to hear from him. And then the second was with Tom Chick, who's a hardcore gamer and commentator, but not much of a war gamer. But I guess he had a bunch of complaints about our hobby. I have to say, I disagree with almost everything he said, as I feel he's just got his facts wrong and he chose poor examples. It's like our hobby is a monolith and it's only one thing. I don't know why it's so hard for people to see that there's a little bit of something for everyone in what we do here. But anyway, I was happy to listen just because I was just glad to have the Wild Weasel back. So I look forward to more episodes. Anyway, that's it. That's it for me, Grant Winterberg, and another episode of Pushing Cardboard. Please stop by the website at pushingcardboard.com. It's always great to hear from you. register, have a say in our polls and in our forums, or you can comment anonymously if that's more your thing in our comment sections, or drop by our Discord server. You can find a link to that on our website or probably through Discord search. There's usually somebody talking about war games there at all times of the day. Thanks again for listening. If you're the type to give ratings on iTunes, please rate and comment on the podcast, and we'll help spread the word to more folks looking for good talk about war games. Thanks again. See you next time.